Hi everyone. A quick comment before the episode starts. To keep making these episodes, we need your support. If you're listening on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel and share with your friends. Every subscription helps. If you're listening on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, or any other podcast platform, please give us a rating and leave a review. Your feedback is really important because it keeps us going. Thank you and enjoy today's episode. In our last episode, episode 23, we summarized the history of certain wars and how they impacted economic inclusion for women. And to be clear, war is not the ideal state of existence, but in some cases, it does drive fundamental changes in society. In the US during World War II and in Rwanda and Nepal during and after their civil wars, we saw more women enter the workforce. Those wars created economic pressures which required women to work outside the home. From there, more opportunities opened for women to get education. Government policies were passed to promote our inclusion, culture shifts happened to accept women in leadership roles, and eventually, women in the US, Nepal, and Rwanda are making gains in terms of political inclusion. So in part 2, we ask, what does this mean for Nigerian women? Do Nigerian men have to die for women to rise?
No, we don't have to die in war.
There's also the option of death by disease.
Nigeria is currently the largest producer of cassava in the world. Cassava is a crop used for things like flour, starch, abacha, gari, and animal feed. And cassava plays a really important role in the economy of rural communities. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, women contribute 58% of the total agricultural labor of cassava in the southwest, 67% in the southeast, and 58% in the central zones. In fact, women play such a critical role to cassava production that cassava is often called the women's crop. But this wasn't always the case.
Now, cassava production started to spread to western Nigeria sometime around the mid-1800s. By then, the Delta people had already been processing cassava for centuries. But it wasn't until the year 1919 that people in the lower Niger started to cultivate and process cassava for food. Before 1919, the lower Niger relied primarily on yam as the main crop. It was a staple.
Then, on September 28, 1918, an ocean liner, the SS Batanga, set anchor in Calabar. As you know, the British had trade routes all along West Africa, and this liner was one of the many ships that would go up and down West Africa for trade. So the SS Batanga was probably making its way from Sierra Leone and Ghana and stopped in Calabar. Obviously, it's carrying goods, but it's also carrying something else.
2 passengers who were infected with the Spanish flu. That's the 1918 influenza virus.
Perhaps until recently, Spanish flu has been what some people call a forgotten pandemic. But it was a huge global calamity. In terms of the number of deaths, we're saying 50 to 100 million, far greater than the casualties of the First World War.
Now, the virus probably entered the country through multiple points, but we know that the southern provinces along Lagos, Port Harcourt, and Calabar were hit first. The virus eventually spread up north through the Western Railway, and it spread east through the Eastern Railway. So by December 1918, all parts of Nigeria had become infected.
By the time it was all over, reports estimated that in the northern provinces, at least 80% of the population suffered from the 1918 influenza virus. In the southern provinces, official reports estimated that more than 250,000 people died. And according to a paper by Dr. Dawn Ohadike, this number is probably an underestimate. But the thing about the 1918 flu is that it didn't kill everybody equally.
According to Dr. Ohadike, reports from all the provinces showed that the young people suffered more than the old and that men suffered more than women. So basically, the virus was wiping out young men. Now, this is important to note because, you see, the cultivation of yam requires a huge amount of manual labor. And as long as there were enough healthy men around, the lower Niger region just relied on yam.
But when the virus came along and essentially wiped out the healthy young men, the lower Niger had to turn to another crop. A crop that could easily be cultivated and processed by women and children, who then became the workforce. And that crop was cassava. And so disease, in this case, not war, created the economic pressure for women to enter the workforce. And the economic gains that women made in the early days of the cassava production have persisted till today.
Similarly, the economic gains that women made in Nepal and Rwanda after the wars also persisted. But in the case of the US, there were actually significant economic losses for women immediately after the war. Because, you see, in the case of the US, the men came back from the war.
And now that the fighting is over and the war is won, the little dears can get back to their pots and pans. And now, gentlemen, I ask you to be upstanding and drink to the health of the ladies. God bless them.
In 1946, just 1 year after the war, there were an estimated 15.6 million women in the workforce compared to 19.6 million in 1945, so a 20% drop.
Now, when the men returned, they needed jobs to go back to. Remember, at that time, the primary role for men was to be the financial breadwinners for the family. And to do that, they needed jobs. Women were let go in favor of allowing men to take on those jobs.
But not all women returned to their lives as homemakers. Some women chose to take on lesser paying jobs rather than sit at home. Others chose to fight to keep the jobs they had during the 6 years of the war.
And in my opinion, women can do it. Women want a new world. Women want new ideas, and women intend to get them. Women have shown what they could do in war, and now that the fighting is over, women intend to show the world what they can do in peace.
Those women that remained employed now had to compete with men, which meant that they either had to take a lower pay or they had to take jobs that required specialized skills.
Now, if women wanted jobs with specialized skills, that meant they needed education, particularly tertiary education. The wars made it okay for women to enter the workforce, to become part of the economic engine. But to sustain those economic gains and to grow them in peacetime, education became the key. After the wars in Nepal and Rwanda, there was an increase in the percentage of women getting tertiary education. In Nepal, the percentage of women enrolled in tertiary education went from about 5% in 1996 to 14% in 2016. In Rwanda, female enrollment in tertiary education was at about 13% in 1990 at the start of the war, and by 2019, that number had hit 41%.
But women soon found out that education and economic inclusion alone were still not enough to drive political inclusion. Now, to do that, two other factors had to come into play.
Government policies and cultural shifts. And implementing government policies and changing hearts and minds takes a long time. So in all three of the countries we studied, female political inclusion is still very much a work in progress.
Okay, we'll be right back.
Hi everyone, a quick message. We just launched a new show. It's called True Crime Naija. If you love true crime shows, tune in to our 234 audio YouTube channel or on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. We cover real cases that have happened in Nigeria. Check it out now. Okay, back to the show.
Welcome back. We are talking about the conditions that have created economic pressure for women to join the workforce and how economic inclusion in the US, Nepal, and Rwanda, together with education, government policies, and changes in culture, eventually led to greater political inclusion for women. Now, you're probably wondering, what does all of this have to do with women's political inclusion in Nigeria today?
Well, on April 7th, 2021, Rahmat Muhammad, that's the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, tweeted a picture. The picture shows a map of women's political representation in Nigeria's Senate and House of Representatives. The map is color-coded. The color green is used to show the relative amount of representation. The darker the green, the higher the female representation as a percentage of available seats.
Now, 5 regions of the country, that is the Southwest, the Southeast, the South-South, the Northeast, and the North-Central regions, have at least one state that shows some shade of green. The United Nations recommends that countries have at least 35% female representation across all aspects of political decision-making at all levels. Today, women make up less than 5% of Nigeria's National Assembly, the lowest in the last 21 years.
When we dug into the numbers, we found that there are only 19 women in the current National Assembly and 450 men.
So imagine that you line up all 469 members of the National Assembly and you start walking down the line. You will have to pass about 24 to 25 male legislators before you see the first female legislator.
And of the 19 females, 13 represent states in the southern part of the country. Only 6 of the female legislators represent northern states. And of these 6, 4 represent states in the northeast and 2 in the north central. In the map that Rahmat Muhammad tweeted, there is no shade of green in the northwest states. All the northwest states are white, meaning 0% female representation in the National Assembly. Kebbi, white. Sokoto, white.
Jigawa, white. Katsina, white.
Kano, white. Zamfara, white. Kaduna, white.
I'm actually surprised that Kaduna is white. El Rufai, the governor of Kaduna, is quite progressive in some ways.
Yes, he is. For example, in 2019, 5 out of 11 of El Rufai's special advisors were women. But these are appointed positions, not elected positions. So while El Rufai may be willing to appoint women in various positions, the people of Kaduna are not ready to elect women to political office.
In different parts of Nigeria, there are different cultures that discourage women from participating in elections and standing for elections. There are all sorts of ways by which women are branded all sorts of names just for aspiring to office. Women are expected not to seek for power. And there are instances in this country and in some cultures where some men would say they can never be led by women, which is very archaic, so.
That is Tope Fashua. He's an economist and former presidential candidate under the Abundant Nigeria Renewal Party. And he points out some of the factors that are definitely at play when we look at the relative lack of female representation in the northern parts of Nigeria.
First, there is the education factor.
So education would help, and education is one of the ways of driving economic inclusion for women, meaning that women can find jobs or do business and get successful at whatever it is they do. They can run NGOs, they can get involved in human rights issues. And once you begin to get in that space, you see that they can participate better in politics. If we continue from the premise that I just established about education, I think what has happened in the southwest of Nigeria is, the mass education that they did way back in the 50s and 60s and even in the 40s, and went on into the 80s as well. It was cheap education. It wasn't particularly very standard, but it was a game of probabilities. That if you got 90% of the young people into school, perhaps 60% or 50% of them will be able to continue. Quite a number of them will drop off at some point and not, be able to be. They continue to be functional illiterates and so on. And so I think that was a strategy, but it has paid off. And perhaps you'd see more political participation among women in those parts. And some of them...
Now, between 1947 and 1957, primary school enrollment in the North went from 66,000 to 206,000. But in the southern part of the country, it went from 560,000 to 2.1 million. So by 1957, the South had 10 times as many people enrolled in primary school. Across the whole country, secondary school enrollment went from 10,000 to 36,000 in 1957, and 90% of these enrollments were in the South.
So already, from the early stages of this country's formation, the southern part of the country was investing more in education. This gap in education between the North and South has continued to persist till today. In 2010, the National Bureau of Statistics found that the Northwest had the lowest literacy rate at 60%, while the regions in the South had literacy rates between 93 to 95%. So the investments that the South made early on in education are paying off.
Remember, we said that economic participation is a critical requirement for female political inclusion. In addition to investing in education, the southern parts of the country also invested in business and the formal sectors, such as the entertainment industry, banking, ICT, and manufacturing.
And again, let me say something about the Southeast. Not only did they make investment in education, they made investment into the economy. After the Civil War, quite a number. That was when a lot of the people in the Southeast were actually driven more into business, and then they evolved this apprenticeship idea, which is even being studied at Harvard now. And in time, quite a number of people have made so much money in the Southeast. Anambra State remains the per capita the richest state in Nigeria till tomorrow. And what that means is that there's more money to train the children. Okay.
By expanding the economic opportunities, the Southeast is able to include women, thereby paving the way for female political inclusion. In the Southwest, women have always been critical to the economy. They have a long history of trading and forming market alliances.
But just like with education, the North has also been falling behind when it comes to the economic inclusion of women. A study sponsored by the Central Bank of Nigeria and published in 2019 states that geopolitical zones significantly impact inclusion, but only amongst women. And women in the North are more financially excluded compared to their peers in the South. And if we again follow the logic that economic inclusion and education helps drive political inclusion, it makes sense that the southern states now have more female representation in the National Assembly compared to the northern states.
But remember, it's not just education and economic inclusion that leads to political inclusion. Government policies and culture play a role to either advance or hinder the political inclusion of women. In our research, we could not find any official government policies in Nigeria that set mandatory quotas for women in politics and governance.
According to our National Bureau of Statistics, between 1999 and 2015, female representation in the National Assembly was only 6%.
Female representation in state assemblies was about 5%. Local government chairpersons only had about 9% females, and ward councillors about 6% females.
So between 1999 to 2015, Nigerian women have not even crossed into double digits in terms of political inclusion at either the national, state, or local government levels. Clearly, there are no quotas in place to help ensure that 35% of elected seats are allocated to women.
For some governors, like the former governor of Lagos State, Akiwumi Ambode, and Nasiru El-Rufai, who is the current governor of Kaduna State, they implement informal affirmative action policies. These governors have made conscious choices to appoint women in key positions in ministries, in departments, and in agencies.
And these appointments are actually a really important step to advancing women to the next level of political positions. We studied the 38 women in the 8th and 9th assemblies, and we found that the majority, over 30 of them, had some kind of appointment or elected position before they entered the House of Representatives or Senate.
These appointments give women access so they can build their political networks. After all, politics is very much a game of networks, and when you have to play in a male-dominated game, you need to first get invited into the game. Appointments are the invitation.
But moving from appointments to elected positions is no longer a coordinated game. It's a mad scramble. A scramble that involves spending a lot of money to get the public's votes.
Of the 38 women in the 8th and 9th Assembly, we found that at least 15 of them came from very well-connected families that were likely able to help fund their campaigns. The rest, I'm sure, had to figure out ways to raise the funds they needed. But even with all the money in the world, a northern female political candidate would still need to convince the electorate to vote for her. And that's where culture comes in.
Now, it is not a secret that the northern part of our country is extremely conservative, and it's also predominantly Muslim. And the critical part of the northern culture is that the role of the woman is limited to matters of the home and the family.
Now, some analysts point to the religion Islam and say that it's the reason why women have been excluded from participating in the economy, which obviously then limits their political inclusion. But if we look at predominantly Muslim countries in Africa, like Tunisia and Morocco, they have been steadily increasing female political inclusion since 1997. In 2017, Tunisia reported 31% female representation in parliament, while Morocco had about 20%.
In 2015, 40% of those enrolled in tertiary education in Tunisia were women, and 42% of university professors were women. In Morocco, 39% of students enrolled in tertiary education in 2019 were female.
And Morocco and Tunisia both have somewhere between 95 to 99% Muslim population. So the religion, Islam itself, is not the limiting factor. It's not what stops the economic, educational, and political inclusion of women in the northern part of Nigeria. We dug a little deeper and we found this paper by Kate Meager at the London School of Economics. She points out that in northern Nigeria, the economy is largely driven by informal activities. Work like driving kekes, driving commercial motorbikes, phone card kiosks, selling local films and CDs. These are activities that mostly men do. Then you have the informal activities that the women do, mostly making and selling products from their homes. They sell kosai, that's bean cakes, soaps, material.
The way the North has constructed its economy around these informal activities, the woman can stay in the protected space of her home because it is also her economic space. But this means that there is little to no pressure for her to enter the public space. She can remain invisible. But to become included in the political space, the northern woman has to become visible.
So for Nigerian women to rise, men don't have to die. I don't think men have to die. I don't.
No, not yet. For the women in the north to rise, they have to become visible. They must enter the public space through formal sector employment. But first, the north needs to develop their formal sectors, which would require education and investments that men have to make.
Women in the South are already visible. They also have access to education, and they have relatively more economic inclusion. What women in the South need in order to continue making gains in political inclusion are government policies. They need those government appointments And the 35% quota for women in legislative seats has to be formalized into the constitution.
Hi, everyone. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of a behind the scenes about how this episode came to be. So the concept for this episode and the one before came about a year ago. I was having lunch with my cousin and we were talking about women in the northern part of the country. We're both from the north. And the question that I had at that time was, what will it take for northern women to advance in mass, in large numbers? I wasn't talking about making appointments, for one woman in one department for one term. I wanted to know, what will it take for millions of northern women to make the leap from the home into the workforce? Now, the way that my mind works, whenever I think about a problem, I always start by looking at other places where the same or a similar problem has existed before. We live in a world and at a time where there's really nothing new. Humans are facing the same set of problems that repeat at different times and in different places, but really they're the same set of problems. And so this problem of women entering the workforce and eventually the political space has been solved before. We have the ingredients: economic inclusion, education, government policies, and changes in culture. But the thing is, no society has ever decided on its own to change. No society wakes up one day and just says, we're going to change. There is always an external force that initiates that change. Now, when we ask the question, must men die for women to rise? Clearly, the answer that we want is no. We don't want our men in Nigeria or men anywhere to die. But they will if they continue to ignore the things that are critical for social survival: education, health, good governance. And studies have shown that when you have mass participation of women in the political discourse, in decision-making, these things, education, health, good governance, they get more attention compared to when you have a male-dominated political system. Now, every single time this conversation comes up, men will identify one or two examples of females who've been appointed or elected to a position, and maybe their performance was disappointing. And then the men will say, well, look, we gave you a chance and look what you did with it. And to them, that's proof that women are not ready to engage in decision-making. To those men, I say, hogwash, and I'm not even going to waste my time addressing that point of view. Now, I will gladly trade a female presidency for 50 million jobs that go to women, 50 million university degrees that go to women. From there, you don't even have to give us the presidency. We will come for the presidency, and we will take it. The Backstory is brought to you by E Media Productions. Production copyright 2021 E Media Productions. If you enjoyed this episode of The Backstory and want to hear more, subscribe to our 234 Audio YouTube channel. Episodes of this podcast can also be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of The Backstory was produced by Richard Anyebe, Alexandra Gekpe, Nabilah Usman, Dominic Tabakaji, and Sam Tabakaji. Executive producer Rahmat Muhammad. Special thanks to Tope Fashua, Rabia Hadejia, Stanley Bentu, Aredi Isha, and Gbado Ikaleku. I'm Rahmat Muhammad. See you next week.